bad. Um, this guy said, I hear pros sometimes talk about how a major improvement to their game happened when they stepped away from the software, the videos, and the current groupthink, and just thought about their game. If you agree, what might this have sounded like in your mind? This stage took place for me somewhere between September and October of 2015. Um, I think Bovada was a large part of it. I had just transferred over to that site. I was experiencing sort of a new like vibe around the game from having clairvoyance over everybody's hole cards, and it kind of triggered me to feel as though things could be more accelerated than they currently were. It was sort of the first dose that I had of um, really wanting to use my theory knowledge to justify more exploitative play. So at the time, Brian remembers this, I was in a group of like four guys, and we had been extremely theory oriented up to that point. Like this was the team that I was like using to be the beta testing team to GTO Range Builder, and then it was the same group that I did a couple of like very in-depth PO solver explorations with. So we were very much in that phase of like very like really spun out by theory, in need of a real slap in the face, rebalancing us toward exploitative avenues. But I remember I was the first one in the group to really feel like I have to go try this other thing. I have to go explore in this direction, and I don't know who's coming with me, but I can't do it the way that we're doing it anymore. Um, I've talked about this before on my earlier streams, where like I wasn't really like pushy about it. I just sort of distanced myself even from my own Skype group for a period of time because I had to know what else was possible in another direction. Um, and there was one guy in the group who sort of like came with me on the exploration, and he was the guy that I worked with very closely in terms of building this new like regiment around how we studied and how we learned independently in the months coming up to when I released the first PO Unlocked pack. And he and I like really did well in Bovada during that time, which sort of helped our conviction that we were doing stuff right. So what this sounded like to me around that time was more or less, I can't do it like this anymore. I can't keep kidding myself that this immense amount of energy that I'm putting into the theory oriented approach is actually what's most incentivized. And I've talked about extreme failure in my blog, true failure, which I think is the point at which you exhaust your current paradigm and you have nothing left to give. That's the point that I reached, because of my work ethic was always strong, and it's what drove me like to the recognition that I was in total futility, like futility mode. Everything that I was giving wasn't producing nearly enough utility. I guess that could be the definition of futility. So I hit a point where I had nothing left in terms of energy, and then I had like a paralysis week where I was like just super depressed in my bed, like can't believe that this shit like is coming to this with nothing seeming to be working out and whatever. And that's where I decided that it was worth it from my rock bottom to actually try something new. So for me, it was like a very real distinction, almost like a spiritual thing where I was just like, fuck it. Like, I have to punt the model on complete trust that this just isn't it. This can't be it because of how it feels. I think that was the biggest thing for me is like, even if this is it, I can't live like this, like putting in this much effort with this much internal resistance. It just can't be it. I would look at like the guys that had a lot of success and I'd just be like, there's no way they feel like I feel on the day to day. So frustrated with theory and applying it to PO solver and then trying to use it practically. Question in the chat from Dimitri is, I haven't reached that rock bottom level. Do you think it's mandatory? I think it depends how stubborn of a makeup you come from. For me, it was mandatory, because I came from a very, what I would have called a logical paradigm, which actually was just an over analytical paradigm. And so in my value system, everything needed to be proven to me. Everything needed to be data oriented. Everything needed to be protected in a way. And that's what the allure of game theory is. It's like the ultimate shield. And that's why it attracts people who are fundamentally insecure, I think. And don't get me wrong, like I think it's a necessary balance that you need to have. Like you need to know theory, but I think that the reason that it sunk its claws so deep into the community is because it's almost like what happens when like a community becomes lobotomized by like a guru or like some sort of spiritual leader. Like suddenly everyone's hailing the savior, and that's what I think GTO sort of gave us as a community in 2013 2014 was like the saving grace that we could potentially hold on to that would be, you know, the answer to all of our problems. And then very quickly we realized that we were out of our league, we couldn't practicalize it. Is that my phone? I think I have my voice recognition on. Yeah, we couldn't practicalize it. That was the main thing. And then beyond that, it just wasn't actually all that relevant when the environments were as imbalanced as they were. So for me, it was very much about proving myself wrong because I was so stubborn and I came from that makeup where I needed it to be proven. Like, this is the big thing. I had a belief system that in order for success to be valid, in order for it to be worth something for me, it had to be done in the way that I thought it needed to look. Meaning it had to be done through the theory oriented approach. I had to be able to say, I am smarter than you analytically, that's why I'm better than you. And what I realized from going through that process of recognizing futility, surrendering out of that paradigm, and moving into more of an intuitive learning approach is that the real strength and the real intelligence is in the ability to flexibly shift out of your current paradigm. And so that's why I speak a lot about trust, because while trust seems like this lofty type of concept that, you know, is almost like spiritual in nature and feels like it has no real potency in terms of someone who thinks analytically, really it's extremely intelligent. It's extremely logical because once you understand how paradigms function, you see that trust is the only thing that allows you to ever actually remove yourself from one paradigm, which is very necessary when you're dealing with a very imbalanced paradigm. My paradigm was imbalanced because I needed to prove everything in the way that I predefined it needed to be proven. The problem being that the way I thought it needed to be proven wasn't accurate in the first place. And it wasn't practical, which is where all the resistance was coming from, because I was trying to apply myself in areas that were outside of my capacity to implement and interpret. So, one of my main questions I ask myself as a coach constantly is like when I'm cycling through my current students at any time, I'm like I'm constantly fascinated to see like, you know, which one of these guys is most like me, which one of these guys is least like me, and in a very non-judgmental way, it becomes about how to facilitate their growth the fastest based on their level of current humility. Like I know I would have been a fucking nightmare to coach back in the day. Um, and I think a lot of it came from having worked with Matthew Janda, and even then I was just probably very annoying with how many questions I asked and how much I needed it to be proven. Having gone through that 2 or 3 years of intense theory study with him, I came out thinking that theory was what made me better than everyone. And so I was very stuck in that paradigm of like, you know, needs to be proven or don't try to bring it to me because, you know, you're foolish for trying to say that anything could be gained from intuition or whatever. That was my mode. So when I look at my students, I'm like, okay, this guy is extremely stubborn. He probably needs to learn more through application and futility. This guy is much more humble. He can probably just point and click as he's told. But really, what I try to do as a coach is facilitate a level of personal trust so that the student can have as much of that suffering alleviated as possible. Like for everyone, there's a certain resistance between what you're currently doing and then moving into the next paradigm, the more trusting paradigm, the trust aspect of it being, okay, something I was doing was wrong and it's time to admit that. So for me, that process was very, very difficult and I had a ton of resistance to it. For other people, I think it's more natural, but the job of the coach, I think, is to facilitate the lubricant for that process. And you can do that by, I think you can do that better by letting the student know that you actually care about his growth and letting him know that you are trustworthy and you're leading him in a direction that's not for my own personal interest. Like, I think once he sees that I'm actually showing up with an intention to see him grow, which can be communicated. Like, that's the main difference. Like, I don't know how other coaches show up, and I don't pretend to say what's best, but like, I know when I show up, you will feel it that I actually care whether or not you're getting results. And I feel like that's a big difference in the student's ability to relax his insistence or become malleable to shifting his paradigm. Is like, he's like, okay, this is safe. I think that's what it is. It's like, this feels safe because I feel like this guy cares, he has results, and he speaks with decisiveness and conviction, and I can feel the truth in his voice. I hope that's what I convey to my students, because I know that to be true. Harry said, you got to leverage periods of futility with ambition and empathy. Totally agree with that. It's a necessary balance to simultaneously understand that you're struggling very deeply in a resistant pattern, and then not try to seek your way out of that because it intensifies the resistance. So it becomes more about a game of forgiveness at that point. And again, these are like spiritual concepts that if you don't understand how they apply energetically to actually blossom as something logical, you'll dismiss them. But if you do that, you're going to cause yourself a great amount of pain, because what you're actually doing is staying arrogant in an over analytical paradigm that believes that there's no value in any of these types of explorations. And yes, like forgiveness and trust, these are concepts, but they point to something very direct in terms of your ability to sort of release out of how you see reality, which is actually the real demonstration of strength. So in other words, the shift that I made from my early 20s to my late 20s was the understanding that it was actually the ability to surrender immediately to any resistance that was more powerful than being able to like push on headstrong. I talked to my brother about this recently when I came home, because I just went through a breakup with my girlfriend like pretty abruptly. And we were talking a lot about like things we've learned, like lessons we've learned about just becoming more open, and especially about like what love actually is. And the thing I told him was that one of the biggest shifts from my early 20s to my late 20s was that I used to think that love was a weakness, in terms of like not being able to express myself. And I thought what a man was someone who was very courageous and like never showed fear and never showed weakness, which I also attributed to being like lovey. But what I actually see from going through my futility and feeling the existential burn that created, the resistance inside of me that created to be closed off, it actually was a form of fear. So now my definition of a man is someone who can embrace literally any situation, with love in your heart, knowing that it's just more beneficial for all parties involved when you're not protecting anything. And I feel like that's what carries itself nicely over into every aspect of your life, especially communication, especially business, is when you bring that vibe that you function from such a high level of integrity that no bone in your body has any intention to manipulate another person, because if I did that, it would disturb my own personal balance. So that's the key, is that when someone can sense that your integrity is high enough that you would never do anything to manipulate another because it would fuck with your emotional balance, that's a really steady and stable place to be at. And it's why I love Gary Vaynerchuk so much as a like a media mogul guy in terms of like what he's building. I've got his screenshot on my phone right now. He gives away these backgrounds, but like he's got this idea of the honey empire, which is to build basically an empire out of good intention, like good business intention. And it's the first person that I really was drawn to, where it's like you can hear it in his voice if you're sensitive to that type of thing, that he's really coming from an awesome place, and that he's gotten that clear in his value system that this is not that his business success is not going to be modeled upon how to manipulate people in any way. It's going to be modeled upon scaling something that is sort of like ethereal in nature but very real to him in his direct experience. So for me, after coming out of that futility, that's what became very clear. It was like, whoa, this balance point is real, and it enhances itself when I operate from integrity, and it also gives me cleaner, faster, more accelerated learning patterns and wisdom when I stay in this place. So now I will not sacrifice this for anything, because all the money in the world, like that was basically the clear recognition, is that the material things cannot actually change if you're outside of your internal alignment, which is a really fucking hard blow to take in your 20s when you've been seeking for money for like 8 years. You know, I always thought that like my success would be defined by if I got to a certain point in, financial stability or whatever. But coming to that realization that like, oh, that can't actually save me because I'm operating far outside of my integrity with basically how I go about abusing myself daily with internal resistance. And again, a lot of that came from not being open to an independent learning pattern and believing I had to force things in a way that wasn't actually incentivized. Gerard, question in the chat. Hey Nick, can you talk about how your coaching is structured? Do you have some full-time students and then some hourly slots open? Good question. So what I'm doing right now is I've made some exceptions for long-term students, previous long-term students, where I just do some hourly stuff. I have like this sort of pro bono work that I'm doing and experimental work where I've hand selected, I think, 3 guys right now, that are doing a coaching for profits type deal with me. It's not really coaching for profits, it's more of like a coaching loan. Like guys that are playing smaller stakes don't have the money to afford paying for coaching up front, but that I've talked to enough to realize they have an ambition and they're trustworthy enough to basically invest in them and then have them pay back the coaching at a later date. So I'm doing that type of stuff right now. I've got the night vision pack that's at the forefront of my attention right now because we're trying to get that out in late January. And then my official 2017 coaching opens up, I think, in first or second week in January. And what that will be is basically you book through a calendar hourly on my website. And I think the structure of it, I was talking to Brian about this last night, it sort of came together with the lesson that we did. Where I see my style going as a coach in terms of like how my coaching will be structured is that this is a merge of mental and technical coaching. I think it's the highest level of coaching that you can get because it's not, like going into hypnosis and doing all like soul searching work, and it's not just, raw hand histories without investigating what the deep core patterns are that's causing your leaks. It's using hand histories to direct us to where the root of your psychological imbalances are in terms of how you see the game, where your biases are, and then using that sort of like using those two aspects to synergize each other into like a hyper lesson, I guess you could call it, where the hand histories are there only to guide us into the root mental game dysfunction, and then we make big adjustments at the root. I feel like that's the best way to leverage an hour, is for the 10 hands that we look at, 10 or 20 hands that we look at, to be contextualized, similar to what I've been doing in these hand history format lessons on Twitch. But then to have it speak to you on a very deep level that you can go sit with after the lesson and be like, oh wow, this isn't just a lesson in poker. This is actually revealing to me how I am in real life. These are my actual personality imbalances that manifest through the game. I think it's a very real thing, and I didn't start to understand it better until I took on the unlimited coaching guys, and it was the first time where I really worked with guys on a very, very intimate level, in terms of the intensity that we worked together for a short period of time. Like guys that were sending videos every day, speaking mental game every day with me, and then at some point it became clear by seeing enough repetition of their leaks in such a short period of time that there was actually a mental imbalance going on, in terms of like a personality imbalance that was actually at the root of all their leaks. So it's where my attention is right now with private coaching moving on, is that I really want it to be a hybrid of mental and technical, because I think that's just where the most value is. Like we can stay on the surface all day and we can run hands and I can give you the answers, but at a point you're not going to be able to stop yourself from doing the things that are sabotaging you unless you understand why you actually do them, and cleanse the bias. Good troll, Harry. I've got a old group with my buddies that I mentioned that I sort of did all the beta testing stuff with, and since I started to sort of speak out more on the forums, the other day they labeled our old group as Nick's Cult as a good troll, and I was making this joke that like, how weird is it gonna look if I go into a lesson and I have my Skype window open and the student sees that like one of the Skype groups that I belong to is called Nick's Cult. Yeah, I did do that with you, Dimitri. And I feel like that was built is sort of building over the last week. I think it started pretty organically without me realizing what was going on in terms of merging mental and technical, and then it sort of really came together for me this week that like that's the new flavor of my style as a coach. Let's take a look at these four hands, and let's do it in a way that doesn't pay as much attention to the hand history at first, but tries to develop a context out of where this guy's paradigm is coming from. So an extension of basically what we're just talking about. The goal here is to really have a moment where we see it's more valuable to do it like this. It's more valuable to look. It's almost like we're not looking as we're still looking with the same intensity, but we're not looking with the same contracted focus in terms of we don't care so much about the hand. We care about the mental aspects that he's using to analyze the hand in the way that he is to expose something deeper. So let's try to find everything we can from this first hand. Button, he's giving reads. Okay, cool. With his c-bet bin high, I thought this would be a good board to check raise. So he checks this flop. Okay, so that's like an okay general concept that he's looking to play exploitatively versus guys who have, like high stabbing frequencies, I guess. But one thing it shows is that he's not interested in simplified, well-balanced strategies on the flop nearly as much as he is about trying to exploit. And that's not bad. It's just that immediately, if a small stakes player is posting this and his only reason is that, he has a high C bet, I thought it would be a good board to check raise. Well, I guess that's okay, but does he have a high stab? Because he's not c betting here. I guess that's what he means. Maybe this guy has a high stab frequency. That's the stat that I would really want. So okay, so he check raises, button calls. Oh, it looks like he posted that twice. I could think him having an 8 or king queen unless spades. Is this a bad call or correct? So he's looking for hands that he's still. I think he's looking for hands that beat him. I mean, there's not really a lot here in terms of his thought process, but I can tell that if you're posting a question like this and then you're saying, is this a bad call or correct call? It shows that you're not familiar with mass database analysis or the bottom of what the bottom of your villain's value betting range would be on average. Personally, I think it's a pretty clear fold because I don't think that people are going to be ever value betting worse. I mean, you have kings here, so even if he's betting something like two pair or a set, like that makes your case even worse because it's harder for him to be imbalanced with bluffs. Yeah, like I think that he could have some spades, but there's just not enough unpaired spade hands in his range on a board like this that has so much Broadway connectivity. So let's take a look at the second one and see what we can build on. Like so far, I see that there's unfamiliar. He's in an unfamiliar zone, it seems like, when he's assessing how to bluff catch in spots, which I think is like a very, very common trend. It's like you don't know what the most relevant data point is. Here I see like really high confidence texture plus mass database frequency reads that show me that people are just not going to be showing up with worse value or enough bluffs in the spot. Hey, there's been 3 posts since I started my thing. Oh, that's what that message was for. Okay, cool. I'll get to that next. I flatted because the big blind had showed a tendency to squeeze quite wide. So I see sort of an assumptiveness in this guy's context that like he's almost attributing too much to like his reads. Like I doubt that the big blind's actually squeezing so wide that you're incentivized to flat aces pre-flop. Just keep it simple. Um, I would need a lot of confidence before I basically did something like that, which probably means like a lot of data, which maybe he has, but I'm weary of a small stakes player doing unorthodox stuff for this type of reason because it's usually a bias reason, something that's not either rooted in mass data or something. Yeah, I think guess they're the same thing. If it's not rooted in mass data, the reason he's doing it is because he's got some sort of distortion going on in his mentality in terms of how he thinks the environment plays when they actually aren't doing that as often as he thinks. And at small stakes, like it's a common syndrome. There's a lot of paranoia that runs rampant, that kind of twists players' perspective of reality in that sort of funhouse way. So you see most of the arrogance that comes from small stakes players um, is innocent, but it's still harmful in the sense that they just believe in their own bias. Like they'll just state shit like this, which again, like could be true, but most of the time I don't think this is as true as the statement. So he decides to flat on the cutoff with aces, and it goes 3-way to the flop. UTGC bets, hero raises, big blind folds, UTG calls. This is a example of a bad way to formulate forum questions. He's 2 for 2 now where he hasn't offered any of his thought process analysis. Like I'm trying to figure out why I'm struggling to help this question, and it's because he's not generating any sort of context for us to help with. Like the reason that you would call turn is if you think that he can have semi bluffs or value that you'd still dominate. And then you're never going to get to that read unless you know what the environmental trends are in this line, which I think for the most part could be geared toward jamming with some pocket kings and queens. But for the most part, I think it's just going to be like a lot of sets, a lot of 2 pairs. I think I would need a higher confidence to call off here with aces versus a raise of that sizing. Like he's probably 3/4 potting it or something. So yeah, like I think overpairs are like commonly going to be called down in this line, and I don't think it gets bluffed nearly enough. So I think, especially if you have the ace of hearts, I'm not sure if you do. Well, yeah, you do. So that makes it even worse, because he could never be ripping like Broadway nut flush draws. So I'm basically looking at how assumptive is it that he rips a worse value hand here in a spot where I don't think he's bluffing nearly enough. But you see where I am in the context, and how if he doesn't state what aspect of his thought process is confusing, it's very hard to point out what the relevant adjustment is. It's very hard for the coach to point out what the relevant adjustment is in his thought process, and I sort of have to organize the entire context myself. So realize that it's a poor question to be asking, or just a poor way to formulate the question, because you're not giving someone anything to work with. Once you realize that the only reason you should be answering a question is to get to the point where you can prove the assumption of the question irrelevant. In other words, oh, this is such a big point, and I want to be able to articulate it well. But you saw it happen on the stream on Monday, where one of the guys asked Nick, how do you separate, he asked something like, how do you focus on the best aspects of your game to develop while still being sensitive to the environment? And he asked the question as if they were 2 separate things. And when I answered it, I pointed out that the question separated 2 things that were not actually separate. So the best answers are the one that renders the question irrelevant. And in order to expose the assumption of a question, you have to deliver more context in your question. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do that. So when you're asking a question in a forum, you should be very open about stating your own thought process, because it's only by having your thought process in front that you can allow someone who understands more about the situation to bridge you to where you need to be by understanding, okay, he sees it this way, this is where his bias is, and then here's the bridge that I can create to expose his assumption and cleanse the bias so he ends up with an accurate solution. Question in the chat: what if he was on autopilot and not actually aware of what his thought process was? Well, that's a problem in itself. If you don't have a thought process, that's a huge mental game leak. So at that point, it could become like, yeah, I know that stuff does happen, but the better way to go about it would be to use the hand history as a way to simulate the hand and approach it from a higher intensity now that you're posting in a forum, and try to come up with a thought process. See, what I love about this training style of merging mental game with technical is that it requires a really high level of personal honesty from you if you're going to make any significant gains, because you will not be able to stop perpetuating your own imbalances unless you understand what philosophies you have that cause them to basically repeat themselves. Something that you perceive in reality, whether it be unconscious, which it usually is when you're autopiloting, is causing you to question yourself or just believe that a certain avenue or decision point is beneficial when it's actually not. So the entire coaching process in this style of merging mental with technical is to develop a comfortable enough environment with the student, and I think that's why the trust is so important, that he can actually feel okay looking really deeply into him and discovering what the unconscious thought patterns are that he's been autopilot engaging. Now, we could take it to one level up, where once there's been enough integration done into mass database analysis, pattern recognition, training for relevant data points that could cut the entire decision tree off because they're just the most important point of the hand, then at that point we get into that grandmaster type level that I was talking about from that Josh Waitzkin book, where you use numbers to leave numbers. Meaning that now, because of the fact that all of the really advanced data is integrated enough that it doesn't need to be processed consciously anymore, now you enter more of a, I guess what you would call intuitive play style, where you look and you know through pattern recognition that doesn't need to be conscious in terms of its thought process, but it actually is backed up by a lot of analytics. I think so. That's the highest level that you get to. And then the funny thing is that looks very much like the autopilot lowest level of no thought process, but realize how they're completely different. It's like the lowest, and then you end up with like where the community's at with the conscious theory oriented analysis, which is equally as futile but a little bit of an improvement. And then the highest level, which is blending exploitative with theory by using mass database analysis and integrating it to the point where you don't consciously think anymore. So this is a good example of how, depending on what paradigm you're approaching it from, different things are helpful for different people at certain stages, and there's multiple truths. Like, yes, it's awful to have no thought process when you're not backed up with mass database analysis already integrated. Once you get that mass data integration, it's good to have no thought process again. I love how I'm like slowly slipping down. I have my legs spread and my slippers on. I hope I made that clear, Dimitri. The theory-oriented context is an improvement on the autopilot, but it still has a very low cap on its potential. And then the next level, like we could say there's 3 levels, even though there's infinite levels between them, but the pinnacle level would be total mass database pattern recognition integration, where you're not thinking consciously about anything because you've already done all the work outside of the table. Like there's still certain aspects of pattern recognition that you'll pick up on, and then your energy will be basically designated toward cycling through all the data points available and then plucking the most relevant one. Like that's where the mental energy goes to once you're at that higher level, I would say. CZTS. Thank you, bro. Appreciate you. Let's keep going with this guy. Although I almost don't want to. I'm going to give him one more shot to ask a better question. So here we're basically vacuumed. Only 14 hands on a player. Hero's calling a 3-bet. Button versus big blind with queen jack off. Should I value bet river? If so, what sizing? What do we do if re-raised? So again, strike 3. You have to make some sort of range assessment in order for us to detect if, like, okay, here's the thing. If you had a thought process for what you should be value betting, it would be connected to what you think his range looks like. Because you're asking a really general question of should I value bet river, there's not enough effort or personal honesty being put there. Like if you're going to ask a good form question, prepare to put your heart on your sleeve and say, this was my thought process. Do you guys see assumption with it? The reason that I don't like questions like these is like, okay, so you want the answer spoon-fed from you, but you don't actually want to expose where you were assumptive. I don't know if it's like a fear of exposing the thought process or a lack of thought process, but the first step is to express what you think villain's range is like on the river so that you can go into the relevant train of thought of like, okay, so what should the bottom of my value range be? And then if you produce that, like, here's what I thought his range was, and then here's why I thought I should value bet because I think he still calls often enough with weaker spade X or, you know, sets or whatever. Now we have something to work with where we can balance assumption. So yeah. Zodi recommended to leave a short comment. The reason that I'm hesitant to do that unless I'm really going to sit down and do it in the right way is that I know how easily that will trigger someone who comes from a paradigm that is either very much on autopilot and really confused as to why they don't have a better thought process or afraid to actually post their own thought process. So it might be something I do after, but if I'm distracted by the chat, there's no way I'm going to try to leave like a one sentence, hey bro, you need to ask a better question. Like, I know that's not what you mean. I know I should do it in a way that's more sensitive than that, but like the delivery is everything in terms of offering advice. Because if you trigger someone into a defensiveness, like, oh, my question's not good enough now, and you're supposed to be a run at once coach, like that's how you talk to people, like it's that type of shit that like you have to be careful of. Just because, and this is the thing that I think is the shift, is that I don't care as much about my own self-image of looking like a douchebag as much as I just don't see the benefit of making a comment that's not going to help him. Like I'm not going to say, yo, your question sucks to trigger, like very rarely will I do that to put someone as to make him an example. Because it's that same thing again where like that actually disturbs my personal balance that I wasn't able to help that person more and that I used him as an example when he didn't do anything wrong really. He's not being a cocksucker or anything. The only time that I think I would put someone on blast is if they're trolling negatively. Like I almost once said something to Gay Theory, but I just sort of took the higher route and just ignored him. But like that's the type of guy where eventually I would say something to make an example out of his arrogance, because I think once a person is at that level of stubbornness, that's when it's okay to make an example of their arrogance, and it's actually still a service to them, if they're willing to see it as one. So just wanted to point that out because like I think you're definitely right. I should say something. I just don't know what to say right now in a way that would not trigger him. I'd have to think about it a little bit more. Brian said, I used to not post my thought process in a forum because I didn't want to influence the answers I got in any way. That's a good point. Um, but I also think you're going to get more biased answers by not stating your context to begin with. Like I think that's the problem with that is that the people that are going to give you biased answers are the ones that don't actually know what the fuck's going on in the first place. Um, like it's very rare these days where I'm in a spot where I'm influenced by the outcome because I don't have an opinion. I just have integration of what I normally see in this spot, and it no longer gets influenced by any one trial. So I would say yes, in a way, like this is where we're speaking from two paradigms again. If you're dealing with a lot of guys that will be influenced by your thought process because they're too weak-minded to already be integrated into their own mass database or whatever stable advancements they've made in their own study patterns, yes, you're going to get biased feedback. But if you're asking someone who already knows, then it's safe to voice your thought process. And by knows, I just mean like they already know what's going on in the environment and trust it enough to not let it influence their decision just because of what you said your thought process was. If anything, your thought process will help them say that's assumptive, and that's what you want. Johnny C, what's up? Question. Nick, I know you stab and barrel a lot. Delayed C bet plus bet river and overall play aggro versus checks. It's true. What's your approach versus fish? I think, for example, a stab turn plus. I think, for example, stab turn out of position plus bet river, even without equity versus regs, a lot because I know from mass database analysis that they overfold, but I give up a lot of these small bluffs versus fish. Any advice or ideas? It's a sensitive thing. I can't really. I couldn't put it into context unless we had more hands to look at it. But like, yeah, there are definitely spots where if you're playing a raging fish, the delayed stab is probably less efficient because they'll just call with more like pieces of the board. So it's a hard thing to answer unless we develop more context around it, which we can't really do without hands and HUD reads. Like what type of fish is it? I think is useful. But for the most part, I would say that I still do it. Yeah, I still do stab, but the second stab I think is where I make more of my concessions. I think I give up more on the second stab for sure versus guys that have like really high VPIP. But one thing I will do versus that player type is like sneak an overbet in. Like at some point, this is an interesting point. Most fish in that same live player mentality, like, well, it's just too expensive, have this breaking point where you can create a very favorable or disproportionately favorable amount of fold equity by jacking the bet sizing up to maybe like a slight overbet to 1.5x the pot. So like a lot of times maybe that'll be the spike exploit that I use versus the guy who I think calls with every pair for 2/3 bet sizing, but then suddenly folds way too often if I make it slightly over pot, just because I mess with his mentality enough to believe that that's too expensive for him to be calling with a pair. So there's ways to exploit fish because in that way there's still ways to exploit them because they're sort of in a prison of their own mental construct, like that this pot odds thing is more important than it actually is. So you can sort of play with that. Thanks, Caps. That's nice of you. What did you say, Dimitri? Every aspect of your game got influenced. Yeah, I think Dimitri is picking up on the simplicity thing. Like, oh, like here's the thing that I've been impressed by. He sent me a message last night, or maybe I got it this morning. But he wanted to create a simplified blueprint for where we were currently at his stage in development. And everything, you know what, I'm going to read it. Hope you don't mind, Dimitri. Because I thought this was really good. And I came out of a lesson with Brian last night where we were sort of like brushing up on these concepts. Because when you do something, let me just read this first, and then I'll expand on it. Okay, so this is the message I got from him. General concept. So this is like his general approach right now from where we are, and he wanted to verify that this was sound reasoning. Simplicity. We take advantage of the fact that they fold more than they should and that they don't bluff as often as they should. I should raise first in loose, and I just don't insist versus their aggression, meaning that he's going to take an overall strategy where he's doing a lot of peppering with aggression, but once they play back, he gives up very liberally. So I'm exploiting their universal weaks. They fold a lot, as far as they let me do it, and I step back when I face aggression. They're honest more often they're honest more often than they should be. Even if we fold versus 100% of their bluffs, they're so imbalanced that we're still profiting relative to calling it's true. Our money comes from their light calls and their inability to fight back with their air. At the same time, by doing this, I protect my mental state. So while someone could look at that and be like, that's not going to get you to high stakes, bro, for a coach who's building a context, that's very stable for this current level. I think the biggest thing is like you have to prioritize with simplicity and stack growth on top of that once the student has integrated those themes. So if I were going to give you the simplest approach when facing river aggression, it would be to always fold unless you dominate a portion of their value range. No one wants to hear that because that's so far removed from everything we've studied in theory, and then there's like the whole blocker thing that comes into play and all that bullshit, which isn't relevant once the pools are imbalanced as they are. So obviously, are there spots where I bluff catch river? Yes, but my context is much more advanced to the point where I can identify the certain texture runoffs and lines and player profiles that make for refined river bluff catching. If I'm training someone who I'm aware doesn't have that heightened context yet, the safest thing to tell them to do is to take a simplified approach where they pretty much always just give up versus river polarization, or always give up after the flop check raise gets called or whatever, because they're not hot spots for continuing to put money into the pot. And here's the biggest thing: over a sample of 10 to 15,000 hands, or however many hands you want to play, and I'm picking 10,000 because that's like usually like maybe like a week's worth of hands for a guy before I see him again in a session.